The ice moon had no mercy in it. Kol'Thaan knew this the moment Blatus 9 filled his viewport, a white-blue sphere suspended against the void, featureless as a skull, radiating cold even through the insulated observation glass. His thermal sensors registered the surface temperature, and he felt his frill flatten involuntarily against the back of his skull before he could stop it. His adjutant, Belsarn, pretended not to notice. Kol'Thaan was grateful for the pretense. He had commanded 12 campaigns in his 180 years. He had taken jungle fortresses and coastal citadels and mountain redoubts carved into living rock. He had never fought in cold because the Vrethani did not fight in cold. When you conquered a cold world, you did it from orbit and waited for better weather. But this wasn't a world. It was a moon. A frozen not airless, he corrected himself. There was an atmosphere, thin and bitter and designed to kill, a frozen hostile rock orbiting a gas giant at the edge of human space. And on it, there was a sensor array. And around that array, there were 42 humans who needed to be removed so that the array could be destroyed and the 3 colony systems behind it could be taken while they were still blind. 42 humans. He had 2,000 soldiers. He transmitted the surrender ultimatum himself. It felt appropriate, a personal gesture from a senior commander, acknowledging the gap in forces without rubbing salt into it. He believed, being generous. The terms were simple: evacuate the facility, surrender the array, and every human at Outpost Kappa would be transported to a neutral station unharmed. It was more consideration than most defeated garrisons received. The face that appeared on his screen was not what he expected. She was young, absurdly young, with the pale-toned skin common to humans from cold colony worlds and dark hair pulled back with functional severity. Her eyes were wide. She was clearly afraid. He could see it in her face, the way he could read fear in a Vrethani's frill, and for a moment he felt something almost like embarrassment. She was a child. Someone had sent a child to guard this installation because nobody had expected anyone to want it. She asked for 10 minutes to consult her staff. He gave her 30 out of magnanimity. It would not take 30 minutes to do the math. He was wrong about the math. When she returned to the channel, something had shifted in her face. The fear was still there. She wasn't hiding it, which he found oddly disquieting because every soldier he had ever met hid their fear, but it sat alongside something else. Resolution, perhaps, or stubbornness, or the particular blank-faced calm of someone who has finished calculating and accepted the result. She said, respectfully declined. Kol'Thaan's frill twitched inside its suppressor. He asked if she understood what she was refusing. She said she did. He asked why. She said, because the sensor array stays on, sir. That's the job. She cut the channel. Kol'Thaan stood in his command center looking at the static where her face had been and felt the first cold thing that Blatus 9 put into him. Not the temperature, which hadn't touched him yet, but something more unsettling. The cold of surprise, of a calculation that hadn't resolved the way it should. He ordered the landing. The dropships descended into an ice storm that his meteorological teams called mild by local standards. Kol'Thaan watched from orbit as 2,000 Vrethani soldiers deployed onto the surface of a moon that immediately set about killing them, not with weapons, with itself. The moment they exited their heated transports, the thermal suits engaged and the frill suppressors activated and the advance began. It should have taken an hour to reach the outpost 5 kilometers away. It took 4. The glacier's surface was treacherous in ways his topographical surveys had failed to capture. Hidden crevasses concealed beneath wind-smoothed ice, shells that looked solid and weren't. A constant wind that shifted direction without warning and drove ice crystals at horizontal velocity into any exposed sensor or optic. 3 soldiers fell into a crevasse in the first kilometer. An armored assault vehicle broke through an ice shelf that his engineers had certified as load-bearing and sank to its access hatches before the crew could evacuate. The vehicle itself had to be abandoned, not to enemy fire, to the moon. By the time his troops had established a forward position 2 kilometers from the outpost, Kol'Thaan's 4-hour operation had already consumed 12. His adjutant kept presenting him with updated timeline projections that he kept rejecting, not because they were wrong, but because looking at them made his claws curl involuntarily, and he had started to notice that his fine motor control was degrading. The command center was heated. He shouldn't be losing dexterity in a heated environment. He was losing it anyway. The outpost sat in permanent twilight. Glacis 9 was tidally locked, and the installation occupied a region that received perpetual gray-blue half-light. Not dark, not bright, just an endless dim monotony that his soldiers' bodies had no reference point for. They were tropical species. Their physiology was calibrated for the cycle of hot days and warm nights that their homeworld had provided for a million years. Without that cycle, something in them drifted. Kol'Thaan began receiving reports that his soldiers were losing track of time, that circadian disorientation was affecting sleep schedules and meal timing, that the gray light was doing something corrosive to morale that he couldn't quantify but could feel in the tenor of his officers' communications. He ordered the assault for what his command chronometer called dawn. The attack would go in fast, overwhelm whatever minimal resistance the 42 humans could mount, and the array would be destroyed by afternoon. Then the blizzard hit. Not a storm by any standard Kol'Thaan could reference, because he had no standard for this. The wind reached speeds that made his armored vehicles rock on their landing struts. Temperature dropped to -90. Visibility reduced to zero, not near zero, not limited but genuinely, completely zero. A whiteout so total that soldiers who stepped outside their thermal shelters became lost within meters of the door. It lasted 31 hours. He sat in his command center and watched the storm instruments and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt small. Not physically, he was nearly 2 meters tall, a senior general of the Vrethani Hegemony, surrounded by the most powerful military hardware his civilization could produce. He felt small in the way that living things feel small when the universe reminds them that it does not care about them. The moon did not know he was there. The moon was simply doing what it always did, and he happened to be in the way. When the blizzard broke, the damage report was waiting for him. 3 thermal shelters had failed, structural failures caused by wind loads outside their rated specifications. 14 soldiers had suffered what the medical team was calling cold scale necrosis. Their scales at the extremities had cracked and blackened, the tissue beneath dying in a way that had no name in Vrethani medicine, because no Vrethani had ever experienced it. The medical team was treating it by analogy, guessing at protocols. He reached for the datapad to review the medical assessments, and his claws missed it entirely. He tried again. His right hand managed to grip the edge, but couldn't maintain pressure, and the pad clattered to the deck. He stared at it on the floor for a long moment before bending to retrieve it. His adjutant again pretended not to see, and then, buried at the bottom of the damage report, in the section marked A disornal incidents, the line that made his frill press flat against his skull with an involuntary force he could feel like a hand pushing on the back of his head. During the storm, an unknown number of human personnel had entered the Vrethani forward base through an underground approach. They had destroyed 2 vehicle-mounted external heaters. They had removed 3 supply crates from the secured equipment depot. No contact had been made with Vrethani personnel. The intrusion had been discovered only after the storm cleared. He read the line 3 times. His claws had stopped trembling. His entire body had gone very still. They had been under the surface. While his soldiers were sheltering from a storm that was trying to kill them, the humans had been moving through the ice beneath the Vrethani camp, like something that lived there. Because he realized they did live there. They had been living in the ice for 3 years. They knew it the way he knew the corridors of his own flagship, not as terrain to be navigated, but as home, as the familiar, as the place where you move without thinking about moving. The strategic picture reshaped itself in Kol'Thaan's mind over the next several hours, and what it became was not the picture he had arrived with. He was not besieging Outpost Kappa. He was standing in the middle of a creature he couldn't see, and the creature was very calmly beginning to eat him. The raids accelerated. He started hearing the reports as variations on a theme. A squad of Vrethani soldiers takes fire from a tunnel exit and returns fire into empty ice. A fuel cell cache disappears overnight. A communications relay goes offline. The damage localized and precise, clearly sabotage rather than storm damage. 4 soldiers at a time, his intelligence assessed, never more, never less. Emerging from tunnel exits that his topographical surveys hadn't identified because they were beneath the surface and the surface was all his sensors could read. Striking infrastructure. Always infrastructure, never personnel directly. always the things that kept his soldiers warm and fed and connected, and vanishing back underground before any response could be mounted. He sent squads into the tunnels. He had to. Leaving an underground network in enemy hands beneath his own camp was tactically untenable. He sent 12 soldiers into the largest tunnel entrance they could find and settled into his command chair to await their report. They lasted 4 minutes before the first distress call came. Passages too narrow for thermal suits at full extension. Frill suppressors catching on ice formations and dragging soldiers backward. Claws that were supposed to grip slick ice refusing to function in the cold, confined space. And somewhere in the dark ahead of them, sounds that the squad leader described as movement, fast movement, more than one source, coming from directions that the tunnel map they didn't have, would have explained if they'd had it. 7 of the 12 came back. The other 5 came back later, extracted by human soldiers who emerged from a side passage and guided the lost Vrethani to the surface with what the squad leader, in his debriefing, described as patient, unhurried courtesy, as if it were an ordinary thing, to collect lost enemies from the maze beneath your home and return them unharmed. Kol'Thaan read that debriefing in his command chair with his gloved hands folded in his lap. He had started wearing the gloves when the fumbling became impossible to hide, and sat with the strangeness of it. Enemy soldiers lost in tunnels the humans had built their whole existence around, and the humans had brought them back. Not as prisoners, simply back, as if the alternative, leaving them to die in the cold dark, was an option that hadn't occurred to anyone. On the 5th day, the supply crisis became acute. His thermal suits had been raided for 72 hours of extreme cold operation. His soldiers had been in them for 120. Suit batteries were failing. Replacement cells were in supply crates that kept disappearing. He requested resupply from orbit, and his resupply shuttle predictably landed in a blizzard, a smaller one this time, only 18 hours, and when it finally lifted off, half the supplies it had delivered were gone. The tunnel teams had been there while the storm grounded the shuttle. They had been patient. They had waited. His scales had gone a gray-green he had never seen in a mirror. He had asked his adjutant once, obliquely, what color his scales were, and Velsarn had said the light was poor and it was difficult to assess, which told him everything. The Vrethani color that gray-green was, the color of cold, the color of losing, the color a body makes when it understands the situation before the mind is willing to. Over 400 of his soldiers were combat ineffective, not wounded in battle, wounded by weather, by the moon itself, by a temperature that his civilization had never thought to train against. Because who fights in this? Who chooses this? He watched his officers' reports and felt something shifting in his chest that wasn't the cold, a quality of embarrassment that was specifically military, the particular shame of a commander who has brought powerful forces into the wrong environment and watched the environment neutralize them with indifference. On the 8th day, he decided to end it. Not because he was winning, precisely because he wasn't. He ordered a full frontal assault, all remaining effective combat troops, approximately 1,400 soldiers. Overwhelming force, accept casualties, destroy the array, end the operation. It was not a good plan. It was a plan that acknowledged that good plans had stopped working. The assault began in the gray pre-twilight. 1,400 Vrethani soldiers in armored formation, advancing across open ice, covered by vehicle-mounted weapons, in numbers that should have made resistance impossible. From his orbital command post, Kol'Thaan watched the formation move and for a moment allowed himself to believe in it. This was what military power looked like: numbers and equipment, and discipline and forward movement. It should work. The ground opened, not everywhere, not all at once. In 3 precise locations, seismic charges detonated along geological fracture lines that his surveys hadn't identified because they were inside the ice, invisible from above, perfectly mapped by 3 years of scientific study from below. The ice surface between his troops and the outpost cracked, shifted, and collapsed. The crevasses that opened weren't deep enough to kill, but depth wasn't the point. The front ranks fell in and had to be pulled out. The armored vehicles advancing on what was now a fractured and shifting ice field began breaking through, some bogging down as their tracks lost purchase on crumbling edges, others sliding sideways into the gaps as the ice continued settling. The formation that had looked so clean from orbit was dissolving into chaos before the first humans showed their face. Then the storm came. He could see it on his meteorological screens, a front that his instruments had flagged as marginal, uncertain, requiring further observation. The human must have read it differently. The human must have been reading these atmospheric patterns for 3 years, calibrating her predictions against actual outcomes, learning what the moon's weather meant in terms she couldn't have gotten from any textbook, because the timing was not coincidence. The timing was deliberate. The storm arrived precisely when the formation was at maximum chaos, when the broken ice had scattered his advance and the vehicles were stuck and the soldiers were trying to reorganize on terrain that was still shifting. The wind hit and the visibility dropped, and then the humans came. Not four, not a tunnel team. All of them. He counted them later from their own transmissions. 42 human beings emerged from tunnel exits across a 2-kilometer front and attacked his scattered assault force in a blizzard they could apparently navigate by feel, by memory, by the instinct of people who had grown up inside weather like this. He watched it in fragments on his sensor feeds. Bodies moving fast on ice with the surety that his own soldiers, even without cold damage and equipment failures, couldn't have matched. They engaged at point-blank range and visibility that made anything beyond 10 meters meaningless. In those conditions, all his equipment advantages collapsed. What remained was the question of who belonged here, and only one side did. The assault broke. The Vrethani retreated across a fractured ice field in a storm, leaving vehicles, equipment, and soldiers who had been too cold and too disoriented to run. He watched the retreating formation on his screens and felt the magnitude of what had just happened. Then he watched as his wounded soldiers were collected. They came in ones and twos to begin with, the human assault teams sweeping the ice field after the retreat, finding Vrethani soldiers who couldn't walk or couldn't navigate, who were lying on the ice losing the last of their body heat. The humans picked them up, carried them, helped them walk when they could walk, and brought them inside the outpost, the structure that had been the military objective, the thing Kol'Thaan had sent 1,400 soldiers to destroy, and the outpost opened its doors and took them in. He sat with that for a long time. By the 9th day, the situation in the Vrethani forward base had reversed in a way that Kol'Thaan had no doctrinal framework to address. They were still nominally the besieging force. They had more soldiers, more equipment, more firepower. They could not use any of it. Their supply lines to the landing zone were under continuous harassment by tunnel teams that his forces could no longer effectively counter. Their vehicles were running out of fuel. Their thermal suits were failing at a rate that his quartermasters could no longer manage. And inside the outpost, the thing he was supposedly besieging, his own wounded soldiers were eating human food and sleeping in human warmth, and being treated by the outpost's medical personnel. Then the broadcast started. At first he thought it was propaganda. The humans had opened a channel and were transmitting, and he prepared for the standard psychological warfare content, claims of hopeless odds, offers of surrender, that genre. What came instead was a weather forecast. The human voice on the channel, not the lieutenant, someone else calm and professional, described the atmospheric conditions over the Kappa region for the next 18 hours, temperature projections, wind speed estimates, blizzard probability assessment, storm track, locations of ice instability. It was more accurate than his own meteorological equipment. He ordered the channel jammed, of course. But by then his soldiers had been listening for 6 hours, and they had noticed that the storm the channel predicted had arrived, that the ice instability warnings had corresponded to 2 near accidents in the forward base, that the temperature forecasts were correct to within 2 degrees where his own instruments were wrong by 10. He jammed the channel and watched his soldiers' morale drop in real time as the one source of reliable information they'd had on this moon was taken from them. The music started on the 12th day. He still was not entirely sure what to make of the music. It came from the outpost's external speakers, systems designed for emergency alerts, now turned outward in a different kind of emergency. It crossed the ice field with a clarity that impressed him even as it was driving his soldiers toward psychological collapse. His circadian disrupted, cold-injured, supply-depleted soldiers, who had lost the ability to tell day from night on a moon that had neither, who had been trying to sleep in thermal shelters while blizzards tried to dismantle them, were now unable to sleep at all. Not because the music was threatening, because it was human, and human music, he was discovering, had a quality of insistence that other species' art did not possess. It buried into the mind and would not leave. One particular melody, repeated across 8 straight hours in the pre-twilight, that never brightened, lodged in his soldiers' heads with the tenacity of a parasite. He started hearing soldiers humming it involuntarily during briefings. He caught himself, at one point, tapping a claw against his command console in the same rhythm. He stopped. He pressed his gloved hand flat against the console. 2 soldiers walked to the outpost and surrendered. Then 5 more. Then 12. Each time the outpost accepted them. Each time, according to intercepted communications. They were fed and warmed and treated and allowed to contact their units to confirm their status. Kol'Thaan could not stop the surrenders without ordering his soldiers to shoot their own retreating personnel, and he was not willing to cross that line. So the surrenders continued, slow and steady, like a drain. On the 14th day, he opened a channel to the outpost. He had thought about what to say. He had composed several versions of this communication in the last 2 days, testing language, considering how to frame defeat in terms that preserved some dignity, some professionalism, some pretense that this had been a reasonable military operation that had encountered reasonable bad luck. All those versions dissolved when the lieutenant's face appeared on his screen. She looked tired. She had the specific exhaustion of someone who had been running on adrenaline for 2 weeks and whose body was beginning to present the bill. But she was warm. Behind her he could see his own soldiers, Vrethani soldiers wrapped in thermal blankets, eating food that smelled of nothing he recognized but that they were consuming with the desperation of the genuinely hungry, being cared for by the enemy they had come to destroy. He said, "I am requesting terms for withdrawal of the Vrethani 4th Expeditionary Force. Not offering. Requesting." She blinked once. She said, "Your wounded stay with us until your medical ships arrive. We'll keep them warm." He said, "You could have destroyed us." It wasn't a complaint. It was the thing he genuinely needed to understand. He had reviewed Tamaka's geological assessments, recovered from a data burst his intelligence team had intercepted, the human scientist's voice enthusiastic about ice stress fracture patterns in a way that suggested she found them genuinely interesting rather than merely useful. The tunnel network extended beneath the entire Vrethani base camp. The geothermal weak points that Rennick had used to break his assault were distributed throughout his operational area. The humans could have collapsed the ice beneath his forward base on day 3. They could have done it on day 5 when his position was already compromised. They could have done it during the assault, entombed his entire remaining force in an instant. They hadn't. He asked why. She was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone searching for an answer. The silence of someone deciding whether the answer was simple enough to say out loud. She said, "Because the job was to keep the sensor array running, sir, not to kill your soldiers. They were just cold and following orders. That's not worth dying over." Kol'Thaan looked at her for a long time, at the young face with the tired eyes and the careful voice, at the person who had taken a 30-person garrison and 12 scientists against 2,000 soldiers and not tried to be a hero, not tried to destroy the enemy, just tried to keep a sensor array transmitting so that 3 colony systems behind her would have warning if something came for them, who had turned an ice moon into an elaborate act of hospitality, hostile hospitality, but hospitality nonetheless, every raid designed to inconvenience rather than annihilate, every interaction with his prisoners, an act of care. He felt his frill move, not the involuntary fluttering of the last 2 weeks, the stress response, the suppressor's failure, the body broadcasting what the face was trying to hide. A deliberate rise, a voluntary extension. His frill rose for the first time in 14 days, and it rose in the gesture that the Vrethani reserved for the recognition of something worthy. He had given that gesture to armies he had defeated with admiration. He had given it to commanders who had died well against him. He had never given it to someone he had lost to. He gave it now. He said, "You will be a formidable commander someday, Lieutenant." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely parse. Weariness and warmth, and a kind of rueful honesty. She said, "I'm just trying to get through my first posting, sir." The withdrawal took 2 days. He moved 1,400 soldiers, 1,400 reduced, cold-damaged, psychologically hollowed soldiers, supported by equipment that was failing and vehicles running on reserve fuel, across 5 kilometers of glacial terrain in organized retreat. The tunnel teams did not attack them. The speakers stayed silent. The humans watched them leave and did nothing to speed or slow their departure, as if courtesy demanded that they be allowed to go at their own pace. The last thing Kol'Thaan saw before the drop ship sealed was the outpost, half buried in ice, the sensor array rising above it like a skeletal finger pointed at the sky. Still transmitting. Had been transmitting for 14 days without pause. The 3 colony systems behind it still had their warning. The job had been done. He sat in the heated transport and felt warmth return to his extremities in the slow, painful way of blood reclaiming territory, and thought about what he was going to write. The after-action report took him 11 days. He discarded 23 drafts. The difficulty was not the events. The events were clear. The failure was clear. The tactical errors were all catalogued and understood. The difficulty was the explanation. The Vrethani Hegemony High Command would want to know how 2,000 soldiers with orbital fire support had been defeated by 42 humans, with no air cover, no armor, and a sensor array. He needed an answer that was true. He wrote that they had not been defeated by human military technology, which was objectively inferior. He wrote that they had not been defeated by human numbers, which were insignificant. He wrote that they had been defeated by an environment that the humans had made their own, and that this was a distinction without precedent in Vrethani's strategic doctrine. The Vrethani conquered environments from a distance and occupied them afterward. The humans did something different. They moved into an environment and became part of it, learned it, mapped it, adapted to it, loved it in whatever way intelligent beings love the places that shape them. And when that environment was threatened, they did not defend it the way a garrison defends a position. They used it the way a living thing uses its own body. He wrote, "Humans do not merely survive hostile environments. They bond with them. They learn every crack in the ice, every shift in the wind, every degree of cold. Any world a human has lived on long enough to call home is no longer a viable military objective. It is a trap. His recommendation, formal and unambiguous, do not engage human forces on worlds they have settled." The classified appendix was shorter. He wrote it once, at the end of 11 days, when he was no longer a general composing strategic doctrine but simply a very old soldier who had learned something he hadn't expected to learn at his age. He wrote, "I've commanded 12 campaigns. I've defeated armies, toppled governments, and conquered worlds. A 26-year-old human on her first command held me at bay for 2 weeks with 30 soldiers, 12 scientists, and a weather forecast. She offered my wounded blankets and my starving soldiers food. She played music at us until we couldn't think. Then she let us leave. I was not defeated by a warrior. I was defeated by a host, someone who knew her home so well she could use every part of it, and who treated even her enemies as guests who had overstayed their welcome. I do not know how to fight that. I am not certain anyone can." On Glacius 9, the sensor array continued transmitting. The permanent twilight lay unchanged over the ice field where the Vrethani had camped. Already the crevasses were filling with blown snow, the tire tracks disappearing under new accumulation, the surface resetting itself with the patient indifference of a place that has seen many things come and many things go. In the tunnels beneath, a glaciologist was already updating her maps. In the communication center, a young corporal was monitoring signal strength. In the command room, a lieutenant who had been reviewing supply requisition forms 2 weeks ago was writing her own report, which she filed under the heading of routine operations, because as far as she was concerned, that was what it had been. The job was to keep the array running. The array was running. Everything else was just the cold.